So good morning, everyone. We begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands from which each of us is joining today. In my case, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Welcome to today's webinar. We'll be speaking about gender lens investing for wealth managers, family offices, and foundations. My name is Sabina Curatolo. I'm the head of impact at Bridges Australia, and I'm one of the 4 co-authors of the report, A Roadmap for Australian Investors, How to Invest to Achieve Gender Equity, Racial Equity, Diversity and Inclusion. You can find our report on our websites or via a link that we'll share at the end of this webinar. Please note that today's session is being recorded for public distribution. I'm excited to be joined in this session by my fellow co-author, Manita Ray, and we'd also like to acknowledge Sally McCutcheon from Bridges Australia and Teresa Raja from Capital Human, our 2 other excellent co-authors. And welcome also to our special guest and friend, Alison Pyott from Veris Wealth Partners. We're pleased to bring you this session on behalf of Impact Investing Australia and Capital Human. These are the 2 organisations who produced the report. On behalf of the whole team, I'd like to acknowledge and thank our generous sponsors who made the work possible, as well as the investors who contributed their knowledge and experience through interviews, online surveys, and as is the case for Alison, who are featured in case studies. And before we kick off, just another reminder that the webinar is being recorded for public distribution. So we are here today because we believe that investors can play a critical role in achieving gender equity, racial equity, diversity and inclusion outcomes. As we start this conversation, let's remember that gender is about women, men and gender diverse people, and that racial equity can and should be considered in all gender lens investing approaches. Investing to achieve these positive outcomes presents investors of all types with significant opportunities for improving investment performance, uncovering new investment opportunities, and reducing risks. And we know this, and it's supported by the data. So at the time of writing our report, we found that companies in the top quartile of gender, ethnic and cultural diversity in executive teams are 21% to 43% more likely to outperform the market on profitability. We found that private equity and VC funds in emerging markets with gender balanced senior investment teams generated up to 20% higher returns compared with other funds. And we know that the next generation of investors are investing differently. Women are expected to control 70% of discretionary spending worldwide by 2028. And through important movements like Black Lives Matter, Me Too, and climate change advocacy, the next younger generation of investors are already asking more questions and demanding more through their investments. Globally, we're seeing a trend of investors who are adopting a gender lens within their organisations, in investment processes and through influence. And as some of you on the call today, a number of Australian investors are also recognising the positive benefits of gender lens investing, or GLI. And yet in our conversations with Australian investors, we found that gender lens investing for many is a new concept. Investing to achieve racial equity outcomes is even less understood, and many investors still see GLI as a risk. So for those who are keen to engage, we often heard that they just weren't sure how to start. And this is why we created the roadmaps in our report. The roadmaps provide a comprehensive explanation of what GLI is, case studies and data demonstrating how this approach can uncover investment opportunities and improve investment performance and reduce risks. Our roadmaps are unique. They are intersectional. So this means we consider gender, race, diversity and inclusion together. And we show you how you can do this as investors. And our roadmaps are tailored to different investor types. So today we'll be focusing on the roadmaps for wealth managers, family offices, and foundations. And shortly, I'll be handing over to you, Manita, to take a deeper dive into the roadmaps that are specifically tailored to these investor types and these investor needs. So ultimately, the roadmaps are designed to support you as investors to consider how to integrate gender lens across all asset classes. This means within your overarching investment strategy and due diligence process, in post-investment support, review and analysis, and by adding value to your investment process from a financial risk, return and impact perspective. To support you to do this, we introduced a new 3I framework for gender lens investing. This connects core elements of your company's internal operations with its investment process and its influence on systems. Therefore, the 3I framework. The first I is internal. This refers to how investor organisations are considering gender and racial equity within their own company through governance, people, policy and processes. So, for example, through hiring practices, through inclusive policies such as flexible workplace arrangements and parental leaves, or ensuring that there are pathways to progression, including representation on the investment committee. All of these and more are opportunities to enable the diversity within your own organisation. So it starts firstly with yourselves. The next I is the investment process. So yes, we know that investors have a great opportunity to direct their capital to investments which deliver specific outcomes. But in addition, we can consider how our investment processes contribute to gender and racial equity. So it's not just about what we're investing in, but what decisions we are making throughout. So at every point of the investment process where resources are allocated, we have an opportunity to bring this inclusive lens. For example, if you need to appoint a fund manager, what is the gender composition of their team? How do they make investment decisions? And the final I is influencing. As investors, we have a lot of power. How can we creatively use that power to drive gender and racial equity? Examples include writing to companies requesting disclosure of gender, race and ethnicity composition, and approaches to addressing gaps to help more effective research analysis. Or perhaps it's highlighting in research reports companies that don't meet these diversity requirements. Ultimately, we are aiming to be best in field, and that you'll see is the centre of the 3I process. So it means that we bring integration of gender and racial and equity outcomes under all of the 3 Is. As mentioned today, we're very fortunate to have one such investor on the panel through Alison. Veris, for whom Alison is representing today, has been featured as a case study in our report. And we're delighted to hear from you, Alison, about how Veris has applied a gender lens throughout your internal operations, investment processes, and in influencing the system. So Manita, I'll hand over to you now to talk us through the specific roadmaps for wealth managers, family offices, and foundations, and then to ask Alison to bring it to life through Veris's experience. Thank you.
Thanks, Sabina. And unfortunately, we couldn't see your presentation. So I'm not sure if you'd like to share your screen to show the presentation, because I know we could see it just before.
Oh, thanks, Manita.
I was trying really hard not to interrupt you, but we were sending you messages, but I think you were deep in presentation. But Sabina, as you're doing that, a big thank you, and big thank you to everyone who patiently waited for us to commence. So really, really appreciate that on this cold Melbourne morning and everywhere else you're dialing in from. So thanks, Sabina, for really highlighting why gender lens investing, especially with a racial equity lens as well, is so important. And highlighting some of the key business and impact case statistics. We'd now love to take you through, as a wealth manager, family office, or a foundation, how you can achieve gender equity, racial equity, diversity, inclusion outcomes through your work, using the roadmaps as your implementation tool. And the first slide that Sabina just showed as well, you'll see that within our roadmap, that's the 3I framework that she articulated so beautifully. But don't worry, go into our roadmap and you'll see that done as well. So we'll just take you through quickly how you can use the roadmaps. As Sabina mentioned, our roadmaps are quite unique to many of the others you might see out there. They're intersectional, as she articulated. Just the one before, please, Sabina, thanks. They're also very much tailored to the Australian investor context. So when we're making suggestions and the strategies, they're actually informed by multi-sector experts and perspectives from men, women, globally, including from Australia. And some of the initiatives that were listed are things that you can actually do here in Australia. They also focus on structural changes and, very importantly, how to consider gender and racial equity approaches in investment processes. We've seen through and through that many investors, many wealth managers, family offices and foundations, especially, are considering gender at the internal level through quotas and composition of their board, etc. But when it comes to investment processes, it's limited still. So on this slide, it's an overview of how you can actually use the roadmap. So the roadmaps come at the end of the document, and they're modular. But very briefly, once you know the roadmap that you're looking for, so in this case, whether you're a wealth manager or a family office and foundation, the second step really considers where you want to focus your efforts on. If it's one of the 3 I's or all 3, we really want you to consider all 3, but we acknowledge that each organization has a different approach and appetite and resources to consider this. So you can actually select within the roadmaps which I you want to focus your efforts on. The third step is to consider where you are on your journey as investors. Early strategies are suggested as they are impactful, but likely to require less resources and time to implement. Later strategies are for those of you who've made some progress on your journey in considering gender and racial equity, diversity and inclusion, and you're looking to strengthen your approach. And here is when we've really leveraged the learnings from global investors who have been doing this not just for 1 or 2 years, but up to 10 years. And they've tried and tested different strategies, and we've included some of these as well. And finally, the last step is to actually implement and look at these strategies. So for wealth managers, there are around 52 individual strategies, and for family offices and foundations, there's 108. And remember, these are tailored to who you are as an investor, and they address each critical decision-making point, hence the different number. So if we just go on to the next slide, Sabina, thank you. So let's move on to if you are a wealth manager. So this is like the contents page of what we cover in the deeper roadmap. And they're very much informed by the key findings through all our conversations, through our interviews and our surveys, as Sabina discussed. And really for wealth managers in Australia, we found that there's a challenge to embed diversity and inclusion at the advisor level. And as she mentioned as well, that gender and racial equity especially is very limited in how it's being embedded in the investment processes, and that the demand for clients continues to be limited somewhat here. It's growing and it needs to be more advisor driven. So you can see that with those in mind, and that's just a snapshot, what we've done with the roadmaps, if we've outlined within the internal processes, the key elements we look at, which is the people, policy and processes, and then strategies under each one. Same with in the investment part. For wealth managers, the key decision-making points are whether you're making direct investments or selecting fund managers. And then we go into the influence, because we find this is a really core part of being an investor and how you can influence companies and also influence your clients and other sector stakeholders. And an example of a strategy when making direct investments, for example, is we really encourage you to consider educating your advisors on the benefits of diversity on performance outcomes for companies, providing them with a strong business case so they can also act as the advisors and inform the clients, right? So become advisors driving the demand. If we can move to the next slide, please, Sabina. When we're looking at family offices and foundations, we found that considering gender equity, diversity and inclusion was more informal, so not deeply embedded in systems and processes. But a great finding is a lot would like to do more. While much of the effort was on grant making at the moment in Australia, it was less deliberate around the investment of the foundation's corpus. So we've had a big focus on this, and we'd love for you to consider this as well, because there's a lot of potential here. And very importantly, foundations and family offices have a massive opportunity to collaborate and demand that wealth managers and fund managers become more gender focused, developing their portfolios and their products. So there's a lot of power that sits with family offices and foundations. And for example, you know, in a strategy that we suggest that Sasakawa Peace Foundation do in Japan is to carve out a portion of the corpus for gender. So you might consider a policy that carves out a percentage of the corpus that aligns very directly with gender and potentially other impact-focused investments, and then measure this against your other investments as well. We also have some case studies within our report that you're welcome to go and see, but right now we would love to introduce our real life in-person case study, Alison Pyott from Veris Wealth Partners. So, you know, we have talked a lot about how to do this, but here is an incredible human who is part of a fantastic organization who has actually done this. And I'm not going to fangirl and over you, Alison, but Alison not only has a huge love for Australia, but also wrote one of the pieces that, you know, got me started on the journey of gender lens investing. And I've read it so many times. It's called Bending the Arc. You can download it from their website. But Alison, over to you you can see Alison's bio here as well. But Alison, welcome. We really, really appreciate you joining us as always. And I'm really excited to speak to you again. And we'll start with the first question, Alison. Would you like to give a quick introduction of what Veris does and who you are as well?
So Veris is a independent wealth management firm owned by our partners. We have $2 billion US in assets. We're 100% focused on impact investing, and we build custom portfolios for our clients with mutual funds, separately managed accounts, and alternative investment funds. We don't do any direct deals. Our pipeline's large enough without adding that complexity. Our driving vision is to create a more just, equitable, and sustainable world for all humanity. And we work with high net worth families and family foundations to align their wealth with their values. And we do that primarily with 4 themes: climate solutions in the environment, racial and gender equity, sustainable and regenerative agriculture, and community wealth building. And then personally, I was one of the first employees hired by the firm in 2007 when we started, not the best year to start a wealth management firm. I've been a partner since 2015. I've been leading our Women, Wealth, and Impact strategy from the beginning in partnership with 2 colleagues who have since retired, Louisa Marie Carlisle and Patricia Ferrarivas, our founding CEO. I'm here in the north of Boston, where it's a beautiful sunny day, evening, but as Manita said, I live vicariously through in Australia through television as much as possible, and can't wait to visit again. We'll be there next winter, your summer, my winter as a getaway, and have a long list of places I want to visit.
Oh, wonderful. Cannot wait to have you here, Alison. And, please do join us here in Melbourne so we can show you all our favorite spots as well. We'd love to help our participants, the wealth managers and family officers who are on the call, to really understand your work through the 3I framework that we've created. And so we've got just a couple of questions for you based around that framework. So let's start with internal. And as we mentioned, in Australia, we are seeing investors starting to consider gender targets at the board and senior leadership team composition. We're not seeing this at the advisor level yet. And then considering racial and ethnic diversity is very limited. And we recognize the understanding of how to do this isn't there yet. And you have often mentioned it's a bit of a different, I guess, gender approach at Veris. So can you describe how Veris has been considering gender and racial equity and diversity internally within your organization?
Well, from our founding as a values-based firm, diversity, equity, and inclusion have always been a key consideration. I would say, as you're thinking about your journeys, all the firms that are on the call and participants, this was, while a core part of our ethos, has become more recently much more focused and intentional. Our journey really started around gender lens investing and building the field and helping invest capital. And the intentionality of this is definitely much stronger, even though it's always been a core part of our DNA. We've always had a woman CEO, and as our team has grown, we've seen diversity increase within our firm, gender and racial at all levels. We do have ongoing diversity and inclusion training within our firm to address, understand implicit and explicit bias and structures. We have been examining our hiring practices, including company policy and how it supports diversity, equity, and belonging. Some examples of that is bringing EDI consultants in to talk about, help us adjust the language in our job descriptions, such as softening or removing education requirements, which could be a hurdle for the diverse candidates that we'd like to recruit. When we looked at our COVID reopening policies, because we've been very cautious at Veris and our employees really like working remotely, we've been really mindful to balance employee safety with our business needs and feelings of inclusion and belonging. That's actually stated in our reopening policies that's one of the things that we prioritized. One of the unique things about our firm that creates belonging and inclusion, we are approaching 30 people by the end of this year, and every employee still values that we do a one-on-one with every new employee, an intern, so they get to know other employees in the firm and create that connection. And this year, one of the things that we're doing, because we have the same problem in the US as far as underrepresentation from women, and when you look at Black and Latinx representation within the financial planning and investment world, it's a very low percentage of wealth managers and financial planners relative to the larger population. So this year we are working with a newer program. This is their second year. It's called the BLX internship, specifically trying to introduce Black and Latinx candidates into the financial planning world and give them a path, both opportunity and exposure, and to give us a path to expand our recruiting into communities that we may not normally be working with.
Oh, fantastic. I love that, Alison. And every time we speak to you, we hear something new that Veris is doing. And I really loved how you talked about things that are beyond quotas, right? And beyond the numbers within the team. And adjusting the language is something we think is so important, because it's not just who you see, you can't be what you see, but language, and it creates an enabling environment. So it's not just about attracting the right talent, it's creating that enabling environment for the right talent to stay. And I loved how you talked about, the belonging and inclusion as you're opening up from COVID, because, it has been a really big change. And then your last initiative as well, I loved it because it's creating a path for these individuals. It's not just saying we want to attract you, but we want to keep you. And then all those other initiatives like the training and changing, really going into your policies and practices is what's going to embed it regardless of whether people come and go. It's within the structure of the organization. So that's fantastic. Thank you. We'd love to then go into your investment processes now. And we see again that it's limited here, right? But we also understand that issues around gender inequity and racial inequity exist in every market. It exists also in every sector and asset class. And there are investors like yourselves who are contributing significantly to increasing capital to women, to minority-owned businesses, and other investors who are also working to improve things like labour force participation of women and minority groups, reducing gender pay gaps. So when we consider this, could you please describe to us how Veris consider gender and racial equity in the actual investment processes?
Yeah, I think for comparison, I'd like to start with when we started our gender lens investing journey back in 2011, there was like 3 products available in the US, a public equity manager, the oldest and now largest manager. There was a nonprofit promissory note that has global investment reach. And there was another promissory note that does work in emerging markets, but it was very limited. And racial equity investing still is incredibly limited because when you look at the data available to invest with a racial lens, what's coming out of companies is very limited, especially here in the US. Getting racial disaggregated data from companies is very limited. So I think we're all early on in that journey. Although we do have some examples, and I'll mention those. So as far as our work, we started with our gender lens investing work back in 2011 after the first criterion convergence. The field was like at the very beginning, and I came back from that conference and I looked at my colleagues and said, the managers that we work with are already kind of incorporating this into their investment analysis of companies. We know how to do this. Our clients are asking us for this. People are hearing a lot of information similar to what Sabina mentioned earlier as far as the statistics about why to do this, but nobody knew how, similar to what you were hearing and what your framework is trying to answer for the investors in Australia. So we wrote that first how-to paper several years ago. It was kind of our first paper, and it highlighted the different things to think about, but also the handful of products. And we were very public, even though that's very unusual in the investment world, to provide what we could consider proprietary information in our private list of investments. We always were very publicly sharing the names of the investment managers because we didn't want to do this for us. We also wanted to help build the whole field. Then we had a client come to us in 2015, a woman investor, very high net worth, who wanted to create a carve-out gender lens portfolio, the women's inclusion and portfolio. And to do that, we did our first scan of gender lens investments. And we used that first scan to then build several more research papers and research and papers that highlighted the different options for investing. And at that point, gender lens investing globally was just growing. And so every year there was like 5 to 10 new products that we were adding to that. And it's become so large. There's now a website that you can go to, Parallels Finance, where you can get a lot of the data that we used to publish in our report. They just do public mutual funds, ETFs, ETNs, and gender bonds. We did do a scan. We didn't release the names because I just don't have the bandwidth anymore to do that on the separately managed accounts. And then in companion to that, Wharton and Suzanne Beagle at Gender Smart Investing does the private investment part, which is much larger as far as numbers of products. And these are all mandated gender lens investments. So that was kind of where we started. And through our inquiry and intention with our investment managers as we started this process, we'd call them up, we say, we're interested in doing this. We have clients who are interested in this. How can you advance your portfolio? And we were just starting dialogue with our underlying managers who then started creating products or thinking about how they could shift how they were doing things. And we still have ongoing dialogue with managers. One of our gender bond managers will call us, probably once a year to talk about, these are the things we're thinking about in the US municipal bond market. Does that reflect some of the things that you're hearing and learning? How can we continue to work together? Then more recently, especially around racial diversity, we started what we call our EDI manager due diligence framework. So we are now looking at our entire investment manager approved list and anybody in our pipeline, and we are applying a framework around the firm's leadership, investment committee, and then their total firm diversity. We are setting targets internally for our approved list of how we want to shift to have more diversity within our approved list. And we have targets for approved new managers, the percentage that we want to bring in of diverse managers. And there could be a day at Veris where we say to a manager, you're not making enough of a commitment towards diversity within your firm, or you're not making progress towards goals, and we no longer think that you're a fit for our clients, which is a very new step. Normally you'd be terminating a manager because their investment process or the people in the firm or the performance. This could be an evolution for us as we try to use our influence with our investment managers on our approved product list. Did I answer your question, Manita?
Oh, absolutely. No, that was fantastic. And it leads on to the next question of influence. But just to wrap up what you said, I really loved how you back in 2011, and just to highlight how fast this has been growing, you mentioned there's 3 products in the market, and you guys were one of the very first people looking at this with Criterion and Suzanne Beagle, of course, and Parallel. Parallel probably hadn't established then, but it's growing rapidly overseas, especially in North America, and we're seeing this more in Asia. We're going to see the momentum in Australia soon, but that is the markets that, we actually need to consider that it is happening. This isn't something that we are proposing that we're not seeing happen. And I really, I think one thing to highlight is then you invested in your own research and to actually inform yourselves even deeper about all of this, which I guess helped then form these new products and also help to demand more from the investment managers that you're working with. So it is a...
Oh, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, yeah. I was just trying to say, it's a multifaceted approach a multi-pronged approach that you've taken. You haven't just stuck to one, you've evolved over time. And that's the nature of how we're looking at all of this.
I was going to say, one of the things, in addition to having conversations with our managers and bringing client demand and client questions to them, the papers that we did, similar to the product ideas that are in your paper, being public about what we saw as an investable product, that created globally a kind of a rise to the top, or created the wave of product creation. I remember being at the first Gender Smart conference in London a few years ago when we published our last full scan. And the day that was released, somebody came to us and said, a major firm wants to come to us knowing how to create a gender lens product. It was how a little bit of FOMO was happening. We're not on this list. How do we get on this list? And so we did see the growth of gender lens investments, partly because we were creating a spotlight on what was available and also a spotlight on who wasn't showing up.
Yeah, fantastic. In fact, we haven't seen that yet here, but I really loved how you highlighted that, because that's exactly what we want different wealth managers to do here as well. So amazing. You talked a lot about how you're influencing others through your investment processes. And I think that's really, really important. And one of the things we recommended in our roadmap is that because demand historically has been limited from clients, that we really need the demand to come from the advisor level. And so in addition to what you've described as well, and I know with Veris, the type of clients you attract are the ones who are already drawn to the fact that you have a very strong impact focus. But could you describe other influencing factors or other things that Veris uses to influence clients and other stakeholders in addition to the clients?
Well, I think because of our mission and vision, we did this because it's the right thing to do. And we saw that we had an expertise. It wasn't necessarily because of client demand. And using our thought leadership helped create more demand from our clients, but also helped grow the field. So I think that was a key part. It wasn't driven because clients were asking about this. We just did it because we knew it was what was needed in the world. And when we saw the statistics, McKinsey's written several papers about, the stats around gender inequity. We've personally experienced it. We were seeing all the research reports about, how diverse teams make better decisions, help for better outcomes within companies, and then McKinsey, talking about better outcomes, for GDP growth. So we were doing it because it was the right thing to do. And again, we had an expertise. And then the 2 client mandate portfolios also really helped with, our influence. The individual, one of the things that she does is try to seed and scale new investment product. And, she birthed really our original scan. And the other client that came to us in 2017 is a US community foundation who wanted to do a carve out gender lens mandate total portfolio to be an example for other foundations that you can do this. And one of the reasons they hired us is we said we would be really happy to publicly promote your portfolio. We included them in our papers. We included them in blogs. Whenever we had an opportunity, we invited them to speak with us at conferences. We would, share their story in conferences or any time that we were asked to speak about the growth of gender lens investing. So, and their approach also was to try to address domestic violence. So, they had a unique approach of not just looking at gender lens, but could they use an empowerment model to address domestic violence, which is very difficult to do with an investment strategy, probably more geared towards a philanthropic approach. But we did think through, affordable housing, access to capital, what are the different ways that we could address that with gender lens investing? The other thing that we did from an influence standpoint is when we're doing our annual impact report is asking our managers for their gender and racial outcomes, whether that's metrics, whether that's stories that we can tell in our impact report, or results from their shareholder and advocacy. And then I think our EDI framework is the newest thing that we're doing that's influencing our managers. And we are now also using that work to influence the field. So we've been published in the Gender Smart JEDI toolkit as an example of how an investment manager can be using their due diligence process and their investment selection to assess their investment manager's EDI, and then how they can also set targets and try to create change. So we're doing it through our direct influence, but we're also doing it through telling our story and experiences with the broader field. And then because policy here in the US continues to be a challenge, more and more we're doing what we can with public policy and shareholder engagement with our clients, but also with signatories, whether that's direct to the SEC here in the US or the White House, or legislation. So a number of ways that we're trying to think of how to use all of the tools in our toolbox to influence not only what our clients are seeing for opportunity and possibility, how we're influencing the field, how we're influencing our investment managers, but how we're also influencing the larger US investment world.
Amazing, amazing. And I think by now, if there's anyone on the call, and there shouldn't be, who even doubts that one wealth manager can't do all of this, you've demonstrated that you can. And also, it's just fantastic that something like domestic violence is being addressed. Like, there's so many questions around how can you actually do that through investments, and you've articulated how this can be considered. So it's not that something can't be done, it just needs to be thought about differently and with intent, and then with partners as well, and being really public about how you're doing that. So that's been so bold. We want to see Australian wealth managers and family offices and foundations do what you're doing. We want to see this momentum grow in Australia. So Alison, if you could say one thing, maybe more, to help anyone on this call and anyone who's going to listen to this webinar to start or gain momentum in their journey, what would it be?
I would say just start, and I do this with my clients. Like the gender lens portfolios we've built, just start, have an intention to do something, and then pick one step forward. We find that with intention and iteration, you'll create progress. I mean, and our story is one example. We started with gender lens investing and a core ethos, and we've evolved, and we are continuing to evolve as we get more information, as the field builds and there's more resources available to us, as we're challenged by other people in the field and by clients. we continue to evolve as well. And I don't think there's no shortage of reasons why to do this. And, we've talked about the statistics. We've talked about more diverse teams make better decisions. We've talked about McKinsey's research about growing GDP. And I think you referred earlier that if that doesn't get it for you, there is a wealth transition I know happening in the US. I can imagine you've got a similar demographic in Australia. We know in general that women and millennials are interested in this. And if at some point they're going to come to you as new wealth holders asking you about this, and your assets will be at risk because they will go find it if you're not offering it.
Absolutely. And we are definitely seeing that here. So thank you for highlighting that as the last point. Alison, thank you so much. We could always talk to you forever, but I'm going to hand over now to Sabina to help close this webinar for us.
Thanks, Manita, and thanks, Alison. As Manita noted, your story, it's both inspirational in the way you showcased the pioneering role you've played, but it's also encouraging for our audience because there is so much opportunity for action. And I also really loved how you talked about the momentum that builds when someone takes the first step, and that your influence extends beyond the direct, but also to influencing the broader field. So thank you. That concludes our webinar today. If you'd like to follow up with any of the report authors, we'd be pleased to meet you with individually or in groups to answer any questions or discuss how you can bring a gender lens to your investments. So Alison, your advice about just starting is spot on. Many investors that we've heard from say that they don't know how to start on their GLI journey. So our report shows you there's many paths to improving gender and diversity outcomes across both the internal organisational structures throughout your investment processes and also influencing the system. The best place to start is from wherever you are now. So find yourself on our roadmap and take the next step. Thank you.